Hello, everyone. My name is Damian Burks, and today I'll be presenting the Cybersecurity Risk Assessment for the Global Economic Summit that is hosted here in the United Kingdom. For the agenda that we have, the first step that we're going to do is that we're going to define cybersecurity risk. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about authentication, authorization, and access control and give an overview of all three of those processes. The third thing is that we're going to take a deep dive into the infrastructure architecture that we have set up and configured for the Global Economic Summit and the security controls that we have in place. The fourth thing that we're going to do is go over the attack vectors and known attribution. After that, we will also discuss the vulnerability assessment matrix and then end the presentation with recommendations to mitigate any vulnerabilities that we have in place. So in this slide, we're going to talk about defining cybersecurity risk. So what exactly does risk mean in cybersecurity? Well, according to LaValle, cyber risk is defined as the possibility of harmful consequences resulting from failures in information systems. So some of those consequences of the risk include financial loss and also business interruption or interruption of the business critical processes. There are several kinds of factors that help contribute to the risk profile for the organization, which include authentication authorization issues. We also have insider threats and also systems and devices that are susceptible to malware, ransomware, and several other types of malicious software or vulnerabilities. So in this slide, we'll talk about the overview or give an overview of authentication, authorization, and access control. So if we take a close look at this chart here, you'll see that we have it split into two different ways. We have authentication on the left side and then authorization on the right. So I'll start with the left and move over to the right. So the first step is authentication. So authentication is the process that verifies the true identity of an entity or an individual. And some examples of authentication include multi-factor authentication. You also have passwords, which is very common in today's society, and we also have single sign-on processes as well. Authorization, however, is the other part, which occurs after the authentication process has successfully verified the identity of the entity or the individual. And underneath authorization is also access control, which is a process of authorization that takes place wherein the method of guaranteeing that the users are who they claim to be and ensuring that they have the appropriate access. And some examples of authorization and access control include mandatory access control, which is a type of policy or process that in which access rights are assigned based on regulations from a central authority. You have role-based access control, which is essentially a process that assigns permissions based on a user's role, and it also follows the principles of least privilege. And then you have discretionary access control, which is a policy or process in which the data owner or end user decides on the access level. So essentially, the user assigns their own access rights to the data. Okay, so moving on to the infrastructure architecture and security controls. So if you take a look at the image on the right or the architecture diagram on the right, you'll see that we have outlined the Global Economic Summits network, including the connection to the two databases or data centers, I'm sorry, that we have within the United Kingdom. We have one in Liverpool and we also have one in London that we connect to for various reasons. So the first thing is that what I wanted to highlight is that we have UK government virtual machines that we've connected, as well as we host a cluster of WordPress web applications um, that are connected to several MySQL databases. And these WordPress web applications are protected behind a demilitarized zone, or a DMZ for short. The in-place security controls that we have in place. So we have a few firewalls deployed as well as IPSs and IDSs, or intrusion prevention systems and intrusion detection systems. We also have network-based anti-malware systems deployed. As far as authentication and authorization goes, our we do have role-based access control implemented, as well as single sign-on and multi-factor authentication for our government officials. So now that we've covered the infrastructure, architecture, and the security controls, we'll move into the attack vectors and the attribution analysis. So here we have a table, and this table is comprised of the attack vectors, description of those attack vectors, the common vulnerabilities, exploits, and techniques that are used, as well as the actor nations that we have tied to, or the known attribution of common vulnerabilities and exploits for said attack vector. So I'm going to start off with explaining hardware attacks. So according to Geeks for Geeks, these kinds of attacks, or this attack vector rather, heavily relies on unpatched systems, unprotected storage devices, and unencrypted devices. So the two types of vulnerabilities or exploits um, that are surrounded by this or associated with this attack vector are Meltdown and Spectre, and those two exploits are closely tied to China. Software supply chain attacks, and this states that the software supply chain attack occurs when a cyber threat actor infiltrates a software vendor's network and employs malicious code to compromise the software before the vendor sends it to its customers. So one of the examples that we pulled was Cozy Bear, which is a Russian-linked APT that infiltrated the US-based SolarWinds or Orion network management software, right? With operation system attacks, one of the most frequently targeted attack vectors, which it is, OS attacks typically stems from misconfigurations or vulnerability in software applications. And those type of attacks, for example, common exploits that we have are Eternal Blue, WannaCry, and NotPetya, which are all examples of the attacks. And WannaCry and NotPetya made history. Um, At this time, we only know of two groups. One is a North Korean hacker group called the Lazarus Group that is responsible for WannaCry, and the Russian military is responsible for NotPetya. So telecommunication attacks. So with telecommunication attacks, so given a contribution of widely interconnected networks and ever increasing attack surface, um, thanks to Internet of Things and 5G, and a brevity of sensitive personal information running across legacy technology, there should be little surprise that telecommunication that the telecommunication sector is widely vulnerable to attacks, right? So created by Light Basin, which is also a Chinese or hacker boot that's based in China. The name of the group is also the name of the exploit. So Light Basin is an exploit that is able to search and find individual mobile phones and target them accordingly based on the personal information and metadata behind the call that is taken at that time, which is pretty bizarre, but it's also kind of cool. And the last thing that we're going to talk about is the social engineering attacks. So, in one form or another, social engineering attacks account for at least the initial attack vector and upwards of 98% of all attacks. And the thing about that is that the most common attack that we have for social engineering is called email phishing. And as far as threat actor nations are associated with, or as far as we can talk about them, there aren't necessarily every nation is pretty much a threat actor in this case when it comes to email phishing. So now that we've discussed the attack vectors and the attribution analysis, now we'll dive deeply into the vulnerability assessment matrix in this case. So for this particular diagram or chart that we have displayed here, what I want you guys to understand is that risk is calculated by the vulnerability times the threat times the impact. So with these attacks we've pulled from our research based, or the digital forensics investigators have pulled from their research. These are the current risks that we have. And then the emerging risks we also have in this chart as well. So the current risk that we have in our environment, we are susceptible to meltdown and specter. The threat for that is pretty critical, but the impact for that would be medium compared to the rest of the threats or risks that we have within our environment here. So you have a bunch of highs for SolarWinds Orion, Eternal Blue, Log4j, email phishing, and so many other things. So ideally, this vulnerability assessment matrix is created for us to be able to highlight some of the vulnerabilities that we have within our environment. And then the next slide, we'll talk about what we could do to, or what we should do to mitigate these issues. All right, so now that we've taken care of, or we've covered the attack vectors and attribution analysis, vulnerability assessment matrix, we will now go into the recommendations, right? So with that, we've identified several attack vectors and vulnerabilities for the entire network. So the things that we must do is, or the mitigation and remediation steps that we must follow is one, um, for any zero-day vulnerabilities without patches, and if we go back to the vulnerability assessment matrix, in that emerging risk category, those are those zero-day vulnerabilities that we don't have. There is one that we don't have a patch for. We have to accept that risk and increase the security controls and wait until the vendor releases patches for it. Next thing is that just so that we're more proactive with security threats and attacks that may happen in the future, we need to tune and create additional firewall rules. We also should tune the network IDS and IPS for those software supply chain of vulnerabilities that we have listed or mentioned in the vulnerability assessment matrix. We do want to ensure that we are patching our operating systems and also are upgrading and updating our software applications. For any data at, at rest and in transit, we want to ensure that we're encrypting that with AES 256 for data at rest and SSL TLS for data in transit. And then for social engineering attacks or mitigating those, we want to ensure that we are training our government officials with cybersecurity awareness training. And that's going to include training around phishing and such other social engineering attacks as well. And with that, I conclude the presentation. I'll open up the floor for any questions. Okay, if there are no questions, thank you all for listening. And if you do have any questions outside of this, feel free to send us a follow-up email. Thank you so much. Have a good one.